Can you imagine? Clint Eastwood, the man who's played everything from a rugged cowboy to a fearless action hero, now stepping into a courtroom as a lawyer. What could possibly go wrong? The murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd gathered outside the courthouse. People stood in clusters, chatting, speculating, and wondering how the legendary actor would fare in a world so different from the glitzy film sets he was known for. But Clint Eastwood, the man with that legendary steely gaze, was determined to prove everyone wrong. He had long been more than just a Hollywood icon. For years, whispers of him studying law, of him learning about the intricacies of the legal system, had circulated in hushed tones. But no one had taken it seriously. After all, Eastwood wasn't the type of person to be found in a suit in a courtroom, especially not in the middle of a tense trial. And yet, here he was. The case was already a spectacle, with the media packed into the courthouse and the public eager to witness the outcome. But no one had expected Clint Eastwood to be a part of it. It wasn't just any case, it was a high-profile legal battle that had everyone talking. A major corporation had been accused of negligence in a fatal accident, and the plaintiff, a grieving family, was seeking justice. It was one of those cases that made headlines, stirred up public opinion, and had the media camped out on the courthouse steps. Clint had stepped in, offering his legal services after an unexpected turn of events. His appearance as the family's legal counsel had set the courtroom ablaze with speculation. What could a man like Clint Eastwood, who was renowned for his tough roles, commanding presence, and unshakable persona, offer in a field of law dominated by trained professionals? Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. The judge, Judge Harrison, a sharp and no-nonsense figure with years of experience, sat at the bench, eyeing Clint as he entered the room. Clint was dressed in a dark suit, looking every bit the part of a lawyer, except for the undeniable air of Hollywood glamour that still clung to him like a shadow. The plaintiff's attorney, a slick, well-dressed man named Richard Coleman, didn't hide his skepticism. Coleman had spent years in the courtroom, watching his career climb steadily while Clint's had been defined by blockbusters and fame. It wasn't every day that you saw someone like Eastwood walk into a courtroom. If anything, Coleman was eager to dismiss him as a publicity stunt, convinced Clint wouldn't stand a chance against a team of experienced litigators. But Clint wasn't fazed. He sat at the table with an air of calm confidence that could only come from years of being in the spotlight. It wasn't the first time Clint had faced the odds stacked against him. This was a man who'd spent decades proving people wrong, whether it was breaking into Hollywood as a young actor or taking on directorial projects that no one believed in. As the proceedings began, the judge called for the case to continue. Coleman made his opening statements, outlining the case against the corporation with eloquence and precision, painting a picture of neglect and corporate greed. The plaintiff's family, he argued, had suffered immeasurably because of the actions, or lack thereof, of the company. He set the stage for what was expected to be a long and contentious battle. And then, Clint stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, no rush. The room fell silent, everyone unsure of what to expect next. Clint didn't need to say anything yet. He wasn't known for speaking much, preferring to let his actions do the talking. But there was something about his presence, something that made people hold their breath. The way he stood tall and squared his shoulders gave the impression that he wasn't just there to follow the rules, he was about to rewrite them. He cleared his throat, then spoke with a voice that was calm yet powerful, "Your Honor, the facts in this case are clear, but sometimes the law isn't about facts alone. It's about the bigger picture." The courtroom was still, hanging on every word. Even Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What Clint Eastwood was about to do wasn't just a legal move, it was the start of a journey. One that would change the direction of the case, and maybe, the future of his own life. He wasn't just playing a role in a courtroom drama, Clint was about to show the world he had more than just a reputation. He had the brains, the instincts, and the fire to succeed in a world where he was an outsider. With every word Clint spoke, the room seemed to shift. The tension that had been thick with skepticism started to crack, and something else began to take its place, a quiet respect, an expectation of something extraordinary. Everyone talks about justice, but justice isn't always as clear-cut as it seems. It's about fairness, integrity, and the people who suffer when those things are taken for granted, Clint continued, his voice steady. There was a pause before Judge Harrison spoke, his voice breaking the silence. Mr. Eastwood, you've made your opening statement. Are you prepared to proceed with your argument? Clint nodded once, his sharp eyes meeting the judge's gaze. I am, Your Honor. Coleman shifted in his seat, clearly unnerved by Clint's command of the room. He had expected Clint to be an easy target, a celebrity playing pretend in the serious world of law. But this Clint Eastwood? He was different. There was a depth to him that neither Coleman nor anyone else had anticipated. The judge, however, was not about to let anyone play games in his courtroom. He gave Clint a pointed look before signaling for the trial to continue. The day wore on, and Clint's every move was scrutinized by those around him. His legal arguments were sharp, his approach unorthodox, but undeniably effective. He hadn't come here to impress the media or play to the crowd. Clint was here to win, and to prove that he was more than just a Hollywood star. As the day ended, the courtroom cleared, but Clint stayed behind for a moment, looking over the case files. He was just beginning, and everyone knew it. The battle for justice had only just started. And somewhere in the back of the room, the question that had lingered in the air began to be answered: was Clint Eastwood truly capable of making his mark as a lawyer? Or would his fame ultimately become his biggest obstacle? The world was watching. And Clint, as always, was ready to surprise them all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Clint Eastwood had always been a man of few words. On screen, he was the epitome of the strong, silent type, those iconic roles that left audiences captivated, caught between awe and admiration. But in reality, Clint was even quieter, more reserved. His private life, far removed from the flash and glamour of Hollywood, had long been a mystery to the public eye. What drove him? Why was he willing to throw himself into the high-stakes world of law? Clint's journey to this courtroom wasn't something that happened overnight. In fact, it had been a long time coming. His passion for justice had always been there, buried beneath the surface of his career. Even in his early days as an actor, Clint found himself drawn to stories of morality, of standing up for what was right, no matter the odds. But this was something deeper. This wasn't just about playing a character in a script. This was real. As a child growing up in the small town of San Francisco, Clint had been raised by his mother and father in a modest, working-class home. His parents were loving, but they were also tough and practical. His father, a steelworker, had ingrained in him the value of hard work and resilience. Clint learned early on that nothing was handed to you, everything was earned. His mother, a strong woman in her own right, had taught him about the power of patience and quiet strength. It wasn't the traditional Hollywood upbringing, but it gave Clint something that was invaluable, an inner strength that would carry him through many of the trials in life, both personal and professional. His rise to fame had been anything but easy. In his early years, Clint struggled like any aspiring actor. He wasn't immediately embraced by the industry, he wasn't the typical leading man. His rough-around-the-edges look, his deep, gravelly voice, and his stoic demeanor didn't exactly fit the mold of the romantic lead. But Clint wasn't the type to conform to Hollywood standards. He carved out his own niche, finding roles that pushed boundaries. His performance as the man with no name in A Fistful of Dollars became a defining moment in his career, establishing him as a force to be reckoned with. But Clint was never content with just being an actor. He soon began to direct, taking control of his own narrative. Movies like Unforgiven and $1 Million Baby earned him critical acclaim and solidified his position as a director who could craft stories that mattered. It wasn't just about box office numbers, it was about telling stories that were meaningful. His films often revolved around themes of redemption, justice, and the human condition, values he believed in deeply. It was after one of these films, Mystic River, that Clint's interest in the legal system began to grow. The film, based on the novel by Dennis Lehane, explored the complexities of justice, grief, and morality. Clint had spent countless hours with legal advisors and experts to ensure the authenticity of the legal scenes in the film. He'd come to respect the law, not just as a plot device, but as something that could shape the course of lives. The experience left him with a feeling that he could do more, much more, than just tell stories. He could actively seek justice. His decision to study law, while unexpected, was a logical one for Clint. It wasn't about fame or ego. It was about a genuine desire to understand how the law worked, how it could be wielded to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. So, Clint began studying. He spent years attending classes, reading law books, and meeting with legal professionals. His dedication to learning was unwavering, and over time, he began to understand the nuances of the law in a way few outsiders ever did. It wasn't an easy path, and many in the legal community were quick to dismiss him. They saw him as a movie star playing at something far more complicated than he could handle. But Clint wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. He'd faced many challenges throughout his career, from doubting critics to daunting physical stunts, and each time, he had risen to the occasion. This time, he was determined to prove that he had more than just the rugged persona of a movie cowboy. His first foray into the world of law had been small. He had taken on a few pro bono cases, helping out underrepresented individuals who couldn't afford legal counsel. He wasn't trying to make headlines or gain fame, he was simply doing what felt right. And slowly, Clint started to earn respect in the legal world, not just for his celebrity, but for his sharp mind and his unwavering commitment to justice. But it wasn't until the case he found himself in now that Clint's legal career would truly be put to the test. This case, one that involved a powerful corporation accused of gross negligence, was his chance to prove that he wasn't just a Hollywood icon, but someone who could stand toe-to-toe with the best of them in the courtroom. He had spent weeks preparing for this trial. The strategy he was developing was unconventional, a blend of legal theory and personal intuition that only someone with Clint's background could employ. He had been in the business of storytelling for decades, and now he was about to bring that storytelling skill into the courtroom. Every witness, every piece of evidence, and every argument would be a carefully crafted part of the narrative he was building. There were still many who doubted him. They saw his entrance into the courtroom as a publicity stunt, a way for Clint to keep himself in the public eye. They didn't understand that this was more than that. This was about proving that even the most unexpected person could make a real difference in the legal world. Clint's relationship with the plaintiff's family, too, had played a major role in his decision to take the case. The family had been through unspeakable tragedy, and Clint couldn't stand to see their pain go unanswered. Their grief had resonated with him deeply, as he had often dealt with loss and regret in his own life. It wasn't just about winning in the courtroom, it was about giving them something that mattered, the truth, and a shot at justice. As Clint sat in the quiet of his office late one evening, reviewing case files and preparing his arguments, he knew this was just the beginning. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to stop until he'd done everything he could to ensure that justice was served. And the world? Well, the world would just have to wait and see. Clint Eastwood, once the rugged antihero, was now on a new journey. A journey where the stakes were higher than any movie plot he'd ever been part of. The first day of the trial had set the stage for what was quickly becoming one of the most talked about cases in the legal world. Clint Eastwood, standing at the center of it all, was ready to prove that he was more than just a Hollywood legend. But as the days progressed, the pressure began to mount, and the case began to take unexpected twists and turns that would test Clint's resolve like never before. The courtroom was alive with energy as the trial entered its second week. The gallery was filled to the brim with spectators, many of whom had flocked there just to catch a glimpse of Clint. The media were all too eager to document every moment, speculating on how the aging star would handle himself under the scrutiny of the legal world. Some saw this as his moment to shine, while others were waiting for him to falter, to prove that he was nothing more than a movie star playing a role he didn't understand. But Clint remained unshaken. His confidence, though quiet, was undeniable. He wasn't here to play a role. This wasn't a film set with rehearsed lines. This was real life, and he was determined to make a difference. Clint had spent the previous nights going over the details of the case, piecing together what he called his story, the narrative that would guide the trial. In the world of law, where facts and evidence were king, Clint knew that winning didn't just mean presenting the best evidence, it meant telling the best story. He had learned that in filmmaking, and it was a principle that could apply just as easily to the courtroom. But his opponent, Richard Coleman, wasn't an easy adversary. Coleman had built his career on taking down high-profile defendants and winning cases that many others had deemed unwinnable. He was known for his sharp legal mind, his ruthless strategy, and his ability to stay several steps ahead of his opponents. Clint could see that Coleman was taking him seriously now, and that only made the stakes higher. The tension in the courtroom continued to grow, especially as both sides presented their evidence. The plaintiff's case, which had seemed solid at first, was beginning to unravel. Coleman had done his job well, he had painted a picture of corporate negligence so clear that the jury seemed ready to deliver a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs. But Clint wasn't so easily convinced. The moment that would turn the case, and everyone's perception of Clint Eastwood, came during the cross-examination of one of the key witnesses, a former employee of the corporation. The witness had previously testified that the company had cut corners on safety procedures, contributing to the accident that had claimed the lives of several individuals, including the plaintiff's family member. His testimony seemed to support the plaintiff's case without question. But Clint wasn't convinced. There was something about the witness's testimony that didn't sit right with him. It was too perfect, too convenient. Clint knew that sometimes, the truth was hidden behind carefully crafted lies, and he wasn't about to let this witness off the hook without a deeper look. As he stood up to cross-examine the witness, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The press cameras clicked, and the public leaned forward in their seats. They weren't sure what to expect. Clint Eastwood, the man known for his tough roles, was now facing a critical moment in a real-life legal battle. The world was watching, and so was Judge Harrison, whose stern gaze followed Clint as he made his way to the witness stand. "Mr. Lawson," Clint began, his voice steady, yet carrying the weight of years of experience. "You've testified here today that the company's actions were directly responsible for the accident that led to the tragic deaths in this case. But I'd like to ask you something. Were you involved in any way with the safety procedures that you claim were neglected?" The witness, a nervous man in his late 40s, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes darted around the courtroom. "No," he replied quickly. "I didn't have any direct involvement, but I was aware of the situation. I know what I saw." Clint didn't let up. "You were aware of the situation, but did you ever report what you claimed to have seen? Did you bring it up with anyone higher up the chain of command? Did you ever do anything to stop it?" The witness stammered for a moment, unable to answer directly. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier, and Clint pressed on. "You didn't, did you? You saw the situation, but you didn't act. You didn't do what you were supposed to do to prevent it. You didn't take responsibility. Instead, you left, and now you're pointing fingers at others." The witness shifted again, his hands trembling slightly. It was clear that Clint's questioning had struck a nerve. He had painted a picture of a man who, despite knowing the danger, had done nothing to prevent it, and now, he was trying to lay the blame on others. Clint paused, letting the words hang in the air before he turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're all responsible for our actions, or the lack thereof. This man didn't take action. He didn't stop the problem, and now he's come here to blame the company, hoping that you'll believe his story without question. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with a loud crack. "Mr. Eastwood, I would appreciate it if you would refrain from making conclusions in your questioning." But Clint wasn't done. He turned back to the witness, his voice low and firm. "I'm not drawing conclusions, Your Honor. I'm simply asking the questions that need to be asked. This man's testimony is not as clear-cut as it seems." For a moment, there was silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, and even the judge looked slightly taken aback. Clint had crossed a line that most lawyers would have avoided, but in doing so, he had revealed a crack in the plaintiff's case, a crack that had the potential to change everything. Richard Coleman's face had gone pale. He had known from the beginning that Clint Eastwood would be a wild card in this trial, but he hadn't expected this. Clint wasn't following the usual rules. He was creating doubt where none had existed before. As the witness fumbled to respond, Clint turned his gaze toward the jury, meeting their eyes one by one. The energy in the room had shifted. The tide had turned. Clint had done what many thought impossible, he had exposed a weakness in the plaintiff's case. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge called for a recess. The game had changed, and Clint Eastwood had just taken the first major step toward winning the trial. But the battle was far from over. Clint knew this was only the beginning. There were still many obstacles ahead, personal, professional, and legal, but he was more determined than ever to prove that he belonged in this world, and that the law was a place where justice, no matter how unlikely, could be found. The courtroom was alive with energy as the trial moved into its second week, and Clint Eastwood could feel the tension mounting. His unexpected cross-examination had thrown a curveball at the plaintiff's side, and though he had gained a small victory, he knew it was far from over. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, and his newfound legal brilliance had only just begun to reveal its true potential. Despite the doubts of many, Clint was no longer just the former movie star turned lawyer. His determination, coupled with an intuitive understanding of human nature, had earned him the respect of the courtroom. But with respect came scrutiny. He was still an outsider to the legal world, and every misstep would be magnified. For Clint, this journey wasn't just about winning a case. It was a path toward something much more personal. He had chosen to take on this fight not for the glory, but for something deeper, the search for justice. This was his redemption arc, not in front of cameras, but in the real world. His mission was clear, to make a real difference. Yet the further he went, the more he realized just how much of an unknown he was wading into. The case itself had grown more complex with each passing day. As Clint reviewed the new evidence, he began to uncover cracks in the plaintiff's narrative, gaps in their story that no one had questioned before. There were lies, omissions, and contradictions that had been carefully woven into the fabric of the case. The more Clint dug, the more these flaws became apparent, but his biggest concern was that the jury might not see them, at least, not in time. Richard Coleman, the defense attorney for the corporation, had done his homework. He had crafted a narrative that painted the company as a tragic victim of circumstance, a well-meaning entity caught in a storm of bad luck. The public, and the jury, had been sympathetic to the plaintiff's cause from the start, believing that the company's negligence had led to the deaths of several people, including the family member of the plaintiff. But Clint wasn't fooled by the corporate sheen that Coleman had polished. He had been in the game long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving, that the true story often lay buried beneath layers of deception. And Clint, with his years of experience playing flawed characters on screen, was particularly skilled at seeing through those layers. It wasn't long before Clint's next breakthrough came. During a routine follow-up of the company's internal communications, Clint stumbled across an email thread that revealed something shocking. The corporation had been aware of the safety issues for months before the incident occurred, but they had chosen to downplay them, citing cost-saving measures. It was exactly what Clint had suspected. The company's executives had knowingly allowed dangerous conditions to persist, simply because fixing them would have cut into profits. But there was more, something even deeper than that. As Clint read the emails, he realized that one of the company's key figures had been actively pushing for the dangerous policies, all the while making deals to benefit personally from the situation. The stakes had just escalated in ways Clint hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about proving negligence, it was about uncovering an elaborate web of corruption that went all the way to the top. Clint knew he had to tread carefully. This information was explosive, and bringing it to light too soon could backfire. It could also lead to devastating consequences. But he also knew that if he didn't act, it would be a betrayal of everything he believed in. The stakes were higher than just winning a case, they were about delivering true justice to the family that had been wronged and making sure that those responsible faced consequences for their actions. The next day in court, Clint made his move. As the prosecution presented another batch of evidence, he quietly approached Judge Harrison. The tension in the room was palpable as Clint requested a private meeting with the judge. The murmur of the courtroom quieted as the judge called for a recess, and everyone waited to see what Clint was up to. Clint stood at the bench, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, I've come across some new evidence that could change the entire course of this trial. I understand that it might be premature, but I believe it's important to consider this material as soon as possible. It directly challenges the narrative the plaintiff has been presenting." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but cautious. "Mr. Eastwood, this is a sensitive matter. What are you suggesting?" Clint leaned in, his eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke. "I'm suggesting that the corporation's actions weren't just negligent, they were criminal. And I believe we have evidence to prove that they were complicit in something far more sinister. I'm not asking for a dramatic shift, Your Honor. I'm simply asking for the chance to bring this to light." The judge didn't respond immediately. He turned his gaze to the rest of the courtroom, signaling that the recess would be extended. The press room buzzed with speculation, and the jury remained in their seats, none of them knowing exactly what Clint was up to. Clint returned to his seat, the weight of what he had just done pressing heavily on him. This was a dangerous move. He had no idea how the judge would rule, and the last thing he wanted was to jeopardize the case by acting too hastily. But he knew in his gut that this was the right thing to do. It wasn't long before Judge Harrison returned to the bench. The room quieted once more as the judge addressed the court. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Harrison said, his voice stern but not unkind, "I've reviewed your request, and while I understand the gravity of your claims, I must caution you about introducing new evidence at this stage in the proceedings. However, I am granting you the opportunity to present this evidence, but only after a full review by the court. The jury is not to be informed until we are certain this material is valid." Clint nodded, relieved that his move hadn't been rejected outright, but he also knew the work that lay ahead. If the evidence was to be accepted, it would have to be carefully vetted and introduced in a way that would not undermine the case. And, even more critically, it had to be delivered with impeccable timing. Clint left the courtroom that afternoon with a new sense of urgency. His gamble had paid off, but there were still so many hurdles left to clear. The case was no longer about corporate negligence, it was about exposing a far deeper rot within the system. He couldn't help but reflect on how much he had learned over the past few weeks. In some ways, the legal world was much like the world he had inhabited for so long as an actor. There were roles to be played, scripts to be followed, and characters to be understood. But Clint was no longer playing a role. He was the one telling the story, and it was one that would shape the course of his life, and the lives of those who had trusted him to fight for their justice. Clint's journey had only just begun. And with every step, the stakes grew higher. The trial had reached a critical juncture. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Clint Eastwood prepared to present his explosive new evidence. The air was thick with uncertainty, no one knew exactly how the judge would rule or how the jury would react. What had started as a case of corporate negligence had now transformed into something far more dangerous, an exposure of deep corruption. Clint knew this was his moment to either secure a monumental victory or face devastating failure. The new evidence Clint had uncovered was damning. It wasn't just about the company's awareness of safety violations, it was about the personal involvement of one of its executives in orchestrating a cover-up to line his own pockets. If Clint could expose this, the entire case would unravel, and the company would be held accountable for far more than just negligence. But it was a risky move. If the judge decided it was inadmissible, it could alienate the jury and set the entire trial back by weeks, if not months. As Clint sat at his desk, reviewing his notes, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had led him here. It had been a long road, one full of doubts, fears, and a growing sense of inadequacy. In the early days, he had questioned whether he even belonged in this world, but as the trial had progressed, he had found his footing. It was no longer about proving himself as a lawyer, it was about seeking justice for the families who had been wronged, and for the truth that had been buried for too long. But even as his resolve hardened, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. He knew that what he was about to do would not only change the course of the trial, it could change the lives of everyone involved. In this moment, Clint had to summon every ounce of courage he had. There would be no turning back. The courtroom was packed. The jury sat in their box, their faces impassive, their attention fixed on the proceedings. On the other side, Richard Coleman sat with his usual confident air, but Clint could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. He knew that the tide was turning. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and Clint Eastwood was determined to make sure it did. Judge Harrison, whose stoic demeanor had remained unchanged throughout the trial, called the court to order. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice deep and authoritative, "I've reviewed the evidence you wish to introduce. I have no doubt that it has the potential to shift the balance of this case, but I also caution you that the integrity of this trial must be upheld. Proceed with caution." Clint stood, his hands slightly trembling, but his voice steady. "Your Honor, I'm aware of the gravity of this evidence, and I believe it is crucial to the pursuit of justice in this case. The company has attempted to mask the truth, but today, we will expose the real story." He turned toward the jury and spoke to them, his voice commanding and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to show you is the missing piece to this puzzle. It's the part of the story that has been hidden, buried under layers of lies. And it's the part that shows, without a doubt, that the defendant's actions were not only reckless, they were criminal." As Clint spoke, a hush fell over the room. Even the most seasoned lawyers in the room leaned forward, intrigued by the potential of what was about to unfold. Clint clicked a button on his remote, and a series of emails appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. The first email was dated several months before the accident. It was from one of the company's top executives, John Carter, to a group of high-level employees. The subject line read, "Safety Protocol Adjustments, Cost-Saving Measures." Clint's voice resonated through the room as he read aloud, "We've reviewed the current safety protocols, and while we acknowledge the risks, we believe it's more cost-effective to delay any major changes. The current measures should suffice for the time being. Let's revisit this issue in 6 months." Clint paused, letting the weight of the words settle in. He could see the jury's eyes widening, the realization dawning on them that the company had been aware of the risks and had chosen profit over people's lives. He clicked to the next email, this time a follow-up from Carter to a select group of company board members. The tone was more urgent, more defensive. "We cannot afford to make any waves at this point. If we acknowledge the problem, it will create a public relations nightmare. Let's keep things quiet, address the issue internally, and move forward. We can't afford to make this a bigger issue than it already is." Clint's eyes met the jury's as he continued, his voice unwavering. "This email makes it clear that the company's executives weren't just negligent. They were complicit in covering up the truth. They chose to prioritize their bottom line over the safety of their employees, and the result was a tragedy that could have been prevented." He clicked to the final email in the chain. This one was dated shortly after the accident, and it came from Carter himself. The subject line read, "Damage control, let's keep this quiet." Clint read aloud again, the incident has become a public relations nightmare. We need to put this behind us as quickly as possible. No investigations, no press releases. We need to focus on keeping things under wraps and preventing any more negative publicity." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The impact of the evidence was undeniable. The jury was no longer just hearing about negligence, they were seeing the deliberate actions that had led to the tragedy. The executives of the company had knowingly chosen to ignore safety protocols and then covered up their role in the accident. Clint had successfully turned the tide of the case, exposing the corporate malfeasance that had caused so much suffering. Richard Coleman, the defense attorney, was visibly shaken. His face had gone pale, and he leaned forward, whispering to his colleagues. He had thought he could control this case, that he had the upper hand. But Clint Eastwood had just flipped the script, and there was no way to undo the damage. Judge Harrison's gavel came down, signaling the end of the session. "We will reconvene tomorrow, and at that time, I expect the defense to present their response. But, Mr. Eastwood, I must say that the evidence you have presented is compelling." Clint nodded, his mind racing. He had done it. The case was no longer about corporate negligence, it was about criminal behavior. The emotional weight of the moment hit him all at once, and for a brief moment, he felt the full weight of what had transpired, the lives that had been lost, the families that had been devastated. This wasn't just a win for Clint, it was a win for justice. As he left the courtroom, Clint allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The journey had been long, and the stakes had been higher than he could have imagined. But as the trial drew closer to its conclusion, he knew one thing for sure, he had found his true calling. The legal world had opened its doors to Clint Eastwood, and he had walked through them, not as a former actor, but as a lawyer with a passion for justice, willing to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The courtroom had gone silent after Clint Eastwood's bombshell revelation. For a few moments, everything felt suspended in time. The defense team, normally confident and unshaken, now seemed vulnerable. Richard Coleman, the lead defense attorney, had been caught off guard by the sudden turn in the case. His eyes darted back and forth, searching for some way to regain control, but it was too late. Clint had struck with precision, uncovering the truth that had been hidden for far too long. Clint's mind raced as he left the courtroom, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. He had done it. He had exposed the corporation's corruption, but the journey was far from over. The road ahead would not be easy, and there was still much more at stake than just winning a legal battle. This case had become something deeply personal to him. It wasn't just about justice for the victims anymore, it was about redemption for himself, too. As he sat in his office later that day, Clint couldn't help but reflect on the unexpected path his life had taken. He had never planned on becoming a lawyer. Acting had been his passion, his career, and his world for decades. But somewhere along the way, Clint had begun to feel that the stories he was telling on screen didn't reflect the story he wanted to tell in real life. He had sought meaning beyond the artificial worlds he had portrayed. That's when he found himself drawn to the law, a world where truth and justice could have real consequences, where the stakes were much higher than a box office hit. But even as he thought about his journey, Clint was keenly aware of the risks he had taken. The evidence he had presented had shaken the foundation of the case, but the defense wasn't done yet. They would come after him, trying to discredit his evidence, his methods, and maybe even his character. He had to be prepared for what was to come. As the days passed, the tension in the courtroom grew palpable. The defense filed motions to dismiss the new evidence, claiming it was inadmissible and irrelevant to the core of the case. Clint knew this battle was far from over, and every step forward would be contested by those who stood to lose everything if the truth came out. But Clint remained undeterred. He had learned the hard way that in the face of overwhelming odds, the best way to proceed was to double down. He had come too far to back down now. The courtroom was packed again the next day, the audience eager to see how the next chapter of the trial would unfold. Clint sat at his desk, quietly reviewing his notes, feeling the familiar weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore, he was fighting for the families who had suffered, for the people who had been wronged by a system that had failed them. Judge Harrison entered, and the room fell silent. His stern gaze swept over the courtroom as he took his seat. "Mr. Coleman," the judge began, addressing the defense, "I've read your motion to dismiss, and I understand the concerns you've raised about the new evidence. However, I've also reviewed the material presented by Mr. Eastwood, and I believe it is critical to the case. Therefore, the motion is denied. The evidence will remain in play, and you are required to address it in your defense." Clint couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. It wasn't a complete victory, there was still much work to be done, but it was a sign that his efforts had been recognized by the court. The judge had given him a chance to move forward, and Clint knew he couldn't waste it. But the defense wasn't backing down. Coleman stood and addressed the court, his voice calm but carrying an edge of frustration. "Your Honor, we request a continuance. We need time to fully investigate the new evidence presented by the prosecution. This could significantly alter the course of the trial, and we need adequate time to prepare." Clint could see through Coleman's request. It wasn't about preparation, it was about buying time, delaying the inevitable. But the judge was not convinced. "I'll allow a brief recess," Judge Harrison announced, "but no continuance. The trial will proceed." As the court recessed, Clint walked out into the hallway, his thoughts swirling. He knew that the defense would pull out all the stops in their efforts to discredit him. They would focus on his lack of formal legal training, his unconventional methods, and his public persona. But Clint had come to understand that his story, his journey, was his greatest strength. When he returned to the courtroom, the jury was waiting. He knew the battle was far from over, but something had shifted in him. This wasn't just a trial, it was a test of character. He wasn't just fighting for justice for the victims anymore, he was fighting for his own redemption. He had spent years living in the shadow of his fame, trying to escape the typecasting of a Hollywood icon. But now, in the courtroom, Clint Eastwood was finding a new identity. He was no longer the aging action star or the former director, he was a man fighting for what was right. The trial resumed, and the defense began their counterarguments. They painted a picture of a corporation that was blindsided by the tragedy, a company that had made mistakes but never intended to harm anyone. They tried to discredit Clint's evidence, claiming that the emails he had presented were either taken out of context or forged. But Clint wasn't about to let them off the hook that easily. "Your Honor," Clint said as he rose to his feet, "the evidence is clear, and the truth is undeniable. The company knew about the risks. They knew about the danger. And they chose to ignore it. They chose profits over lives." His words hung in the air like a challenge. Clint wasn't backing down. He had a mission, and he wasn't going to let anyone stop him from completing it. Judge Harrison called the session to order, and Clint stood, his confidence unwavering. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce new evidence that I believe will shift the course of this trial. It involves not only the negligence we've already uncovered, but also an active attempt to falsify safety inspections and cover up the defect that led to the tragedy." The murmurs that rippled through the courtroom made Clint's heart race. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him, their attention rapt. He clicked a button on the projector, and the evidence appeared on the screen. Emails, recordings, and documents filled the screen, all leading back to one clear conclusion: the company had knowingly falsified safety records and ignored warnings about the life-threatening defect in their equipment. Clint could hear the gasps from the audience as they absorbed the weight of the new evidence. Sarah Bennett took the stand next, her voice steady as she recounted her experiences. She spoke with an unflinching honesty that cut through the air like a knife. Her testimony detailed the meetings, the phone calls, and the systematic cover-up that had taken place. She provided undeniable proof of the corporation's wrongdoing. Richard Coleman stood up, attempting to deflect the weight of the testimony. "Your Honor, this is an outrageous claim. The witness is just seeking attention, and these documents have no credibility." But Clint was ready. He stood tall, addressing the court with authority. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. The documents have been authenticated, and the witness has nothing to gain from her testimony other than to seek justice for the lives that were lost. This is the truth, and it can no longer be ignored. Judge Harrison looked down at the evidence, his brow furrowing in thought. The defense's attempt to dismiss the claim had fallen flat, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The jury seemed to lean forward, processing the weight of the revelation. Clint knew they were on the verge of victory. But he also knew that the final stretch was going to be the hardest. The defense would not back down quietly, and he would have to remain focused and relentless. This case had already changed his life, but there was still so much to lose. He took a deep breath. He wasn't just fighting for the victims anymore. He was fighting for himself, for redemption, and for the future. The days following Sarah Bennett's testimony were filled with a palpable sense of anticipation. Clint could feel the shift in the courtroom, the subtle tension in the air as the defense scrambled to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their case. But Clint wasn't fooled. This was the moment he had been waiting for, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Yet, beneath the surface of this battle, Clint could sense something more. The company had far-reaching influence, power that stretched beyond the courtroom. This wasn't just about one corporation anymore, it was about a system of control that had taken root in every aspect of society. There were forces at play that no one had even begun to comprehend. Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over, and that something far darker was waiting just beneath the surface. It was late one evening when Clint received a call that would change everything. He had just left the courthouse and was sitting in his car, still processing the day's events, when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. Clint Eastwood, a voice on the other end asked. It was gruff, yet undeniably familiar. Who's this? Clint replied, narrowing his eyes. It's someone who knows you're in over your head, the voice said, its tone heavy with warning. You've exposed the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot more to this case than you think. A lot more you don't know. Clint's grip on the steering wheel tightened. What are you talking about? I can't tell you everything, the voice continued, but I can tell you that you've made some very powerful people very uncomfortable. If you keep going down this road, you won't just be fighting a corporation. You'll be fighting a system that's been built to protect the guilty. Clint's mind raced. The weight of those words hung in the air, the implications of them sinking in. Who was on the other end of the line? And why were they warning him now? He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Who is this? Clint pressed, his voice calm but insistent. There was a long pause before the voice replied, someone who used to work for them. Someone who's seen how deep the corruption runs. I'm giving you a chance to back off, Clint. You're getting closer to the truth, and you don't want to know where that road leads. Before Clint could respond, the line went dead. He sat there for a moment, staring at the screen of his phone. The warning had been clear, but it wasn't enough to make him turn back. In fact, if anything, it solidified his resolve. He had come too far to back down now. But the chilling words of the caller lingered in his mind. Someone was out there, watching him. And they were trying to send him a message. Clint didn't know what was at stake, but he knew it was bigger than anything he had imagined. The next morning, Clint met with his legal team to discuss the next steps. The defense had yet to make any significant progress in their counterarguments, but Clint knew that the real battle wasn't just going to be fought in the courtroom. It was going to be fought behind the scenes, against a network of forces that would stop at nothing to maintain their grip on power. We can't afford to ignore the bigger picture, Clint said, addressing his team. The corporation isn't just going to give up, and neither will the people backing them. We've hit a nerve, and they're going to retaliate. We need to be ready for whatever comes next. The team nodded, a mix of determination and uncertainty on their faces. They were in this together, but none of them could have predicted the storm that was about to hit. That afternoon, as Clint left the courthouse, he noticed something unusual. A black car was parked across the street, its tinted windows obscuring the driver. Clint hadn't seen it before, and it immediately raised his suspicions. As he walked toward his own car, the vehicle slowly pulled away, turning down the street and disappearing into traffic. It could have been nothing, just another car on the road. But Clint's gut told him otherwise. The city had always been full of strange occurrences, but this felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, and that someone was pulling strings from the shadows. Later that evening, Clint received an email with a simple subject line, "Don't trust Sarah Bennett." It was anonymous, with no sender information or other identifying details. But the message inside was clear: she's not who she says she is. Don't let her testimony lead you into a trap. Clint's pulse quickened as he read the message. It wasn't the first time he had been warned off Sarah, but now the stakes felt even higher. He thought back to their last conversation, to the quiet resolve in Sarah's eyes as she testified. She had seemed genuine, but now Clint wasn't so sure. He needed to find out more. He couldn't afford to let anyone manipulate him. Not now, not when they were so close to the truth. The next morning, Clint arranged to meet with Sarah. They would have to be careful. If the company, or whoever was behind the company, was trying to frame Sarah, then they would do anything to protect themselves. Clint knew that he had to be on guard. His instincts were telling him that he was being pulled into something far deeper and more dangerous than he could have imagined. They met in a quiet cafe, far from the watchful eyes of the courtroom and press. Sarah was already seated at a corner table, her expression unreadable as she watched Clint approach. "Clint," she greeted him, her voice calm but tense. "I didn't expect you to reach out. I thought you might have already seen the warning signs." Clint sat down across from her, his eyes scanning the room. It was almost too quiet. He leaned in, his voice low. "I got the email. Someone's trying to turn me against you." Sarah's eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and concern. "I knew it wouldn't be easy," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Clint, you have to believe me. I'm telling you the truth. If we're going to win this, we have to trust each other." Clint studied her face, looking for any sign of deceit. The weight of the decision before him was immense. One wrong move, and they could both end up as targets in a much larger game than either of them had bargained for. "I want to believe you, Sarah," Clint said, his voice low and steady. "But I need to know everything. All of it. If there's anything you're hiding, now's the time to come clean." Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to the window as though searching for someone. Clint followed her gaze but saw nothing. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaking slightly. "There's something I haven't told you. I didn't come forward just because of the accident. There's a bigger reason, something I've been involved in that makes everything even more complicated. But I can't do this alone, Clint. I need your help." Clint's heart pounded. He had always trusted his gut, and right now, his instincts were telling him to proceed cautiously. There was more to this story than Sarah had let on. But what was the real truth? And who could he trust? Clint's mind raced as Sarah's words lingered in the air. There was something she wasn't saying, something deeper than the surface-level facts she had already revealed. The more she hesitated, the more Clint's instincts screamed at him to be careful. But he had come too far to back down now. The weight of the case, the lives at stake, and the mounting evidence pushed him forward. Sarah seemed to sense the shift in his demeanor, the cautious tension that had settled in between them. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "I wasn't just a witness to the corruption in that company, Clint. I was part of it," she confessed, her eyes locked with his. The words hit Clint like a freight train. For a moment, Clint didn't know how to respond. His mind swirled with 100 questions, but all he could do was stare at her in disbelief. Was she part of the cover-up? Was she telling him the truth, Or was this some sort of elaborate ruse to divert suspicion? I know how it sounds, but I swear, I wasn't the only one, Sarah continued, her voice trembling. I got pulled in when I was just starting out, fresh out of college. They offered me a position with great pay, benefits, the works. I didn't question it. But then, things started to change. I started to see things I shouldn't have. And I kept quiet, thinking I could just get through it and leave without causing trouble. But after what happened, after the explosion, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Clint absorbed her words carefully. His mind was racing, but his face remained impassive. The idea of her being involved in the very corruption they were fighting against made his stomach churn. But the sincerity in her eyes told him that there was more to her story. She wasn't just some accomplice who'd chosen to ignore the truth. She had been a victim, too. So, what are you saying? Clint asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts churning within him. That you knew about the defective safety equipment? That you helped cover it up? Sarah shook her head quickly, as if rejecting the suggestion. No, I didn't know about the explosion. That was an accident. But I knew about the shoddy practices. I knew about the shortcuts they were taking in inspections. I wasn't just a passive observer, Clint. I was ordered to overlook things, to sign off on paperwork that was falsified, to pretend everything was fine. It was part of my job. Clint's stomach dropped as he processed the weight of her words. He had suspected that the company had covered up its mistakes, but hearing it from someone who had been inside the system made the reality feel even more corrupt. This was bigger than he had thought. And now Sarah was in the thick of it, trying to do the right thing, but she wasn't the only one with a target on her back. Why are you telling me this now? Clint asked, the suspicion creeping back into his mind. Why didn't you say something sooner? Sarah's eyes darkened as she glanced nervously around the cafe. It wasn't crowded, but Clint could sense that she was on edge. The tension in the air thickened, and Clint felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Someone was watching them, he was sure of it. I couldn't say anything before. I was scared. They had my life, Clint. They had so many people under their thumb. I kept quiet because I was terrified of what would happen if I spoke out. But after everything that's happened, after the explosion, I couldn't live with myself anymore. I couldn't let those people die for nothing. I'm not proud of what I did, but I can't let it go on. I want to make it right. Clint nodded slowly, taking in her words. The idea that Sarah had been an unwilling participant in a system of corruption didn't excuse her actions, but it certainly added complexity to the story. She wasn't the villain here. She was a cog in a much larger machine, a machine that had caused untold damage. I believe you, Clint said quietly. But I need to know everything. If we're going to win this case, we need all the pieces of the puzzle. The full truth. Sarah hesitated, glancing over her shoulder again, as if she expected someone to walk in at any moment. There's more, Clint. It's not just about the safety violations. It's about something else, something even more dangerous. Clint leaned in closer, his curiosity piqued. What is it? Sarah swallowed hard, her voice barely audible as she spoke. The company, they were involved in something much bigger than I thought. They had connections, high-level connections. Political figures, law enforcement, corporate leaders, they were all in on it. They weren't just covering up an accident. They were hiding something much more valuable. Something they didn't want anyone to find. Clint's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? Sarah took a deep breath. I don't know all the details. But I know it was tied to a larger illegal operation. Money laundering, bribery, illegal shipments, it was all connected. They used the company as a front to launder money from all sorts of illicit activities. And that's why they were so careful to cover their tracks. That's why they made sure the inspections were falsified. If anyone found out about the operation, it would bring the whole thing crashing down. Clint's mind raced. This was a whole new level of conspiracy. The company's corruption wasn't just about negligence, it was about a complex web of illegal activity that stretched far beyond the factory floor. And now, with Sarah's testimony, he had the key to unlocking the entire operation. "You're sure about this?" Clint asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You're sure this wasn't just some kind of rumor?" Sarah nodded vigorously. "I saw the documents. I overheard conversations. They were making deals with people in power, Clint. I couldn't stop them, but I heard enough to know that this wasn't just about cutting corners for a little extra profit. This was about covering up something big. And they'd do anything to keep it hidden." Clint leaned back in his chair, trying to digest everything Sarah had said. The enormity of it all was staggering. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous it became. There was a network of corruption, and Clint was now at the center of it. If he wasn't careful, the forces behind the company would stop at nothing to silence him, just as they had done with so many others. "Clint," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with urgency. "You have to be careful. There are people out there who will do whatever it takes to protect what they've built. They'll stop at nothing to make sure you don't expose the truth. They won't just target me, they'll come after you, too." Clint took a deep breath. He had been warned before, but now the danger felt more real, more immediate. Whoever was behind this wasn't just interested in keeping the company's secrets, they were protecting something much bigger. And Clint was in their crosshairs. "I'll be careful," Clint said, his voice steely. "But I'm not backing down. I'm going to bring them down. All of them." As Clint stood up to leave, Sarah's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said, her voice trembling. "Promise me you won't let them get to you." Clint looked down at her hand, then met her eyes. He didn't know what the next few days would bring, but he knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let the truth stay buried. No matter what it took. "I promise," Clint said softly. "I won't let them win." Clint walked out of the cafe with his thoughts swirling. His conversation with Sarah had opened a door he wasn't sure he wanted to walk through. The revelation about the corporation's illegal operations and connections to powerful figures made his heart race. But it also made him wonder just how deep the conspiracy went, and how many people were involved. If Sarah was telling the truth, then what he thought was a simple case of corporate negligence was only the tip of the iceberg. The more Clint thought about it, the more the stakes seemed to grow. Every move he made now carried the risk of uncovering something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. If this was about money laundering, political bribery, and criminal networks, then Clint was no longer just a lawyer trying to win a case, he was a target. As he drove back to his office, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His instincts had never been wrong before, and today they were telling him to be extra cautious. He glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadowy figure following him, but the road behind him was clear. He was just being paranoid, he told himself. But as he pulled into his office parking garage, his paranoia flared again. A black SUV was parked a few spaces down from his car, its windows tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. Clint hesitated before getting out of his car, scanning the garage for any movement. There was no one around, at least, not anyone that looked suspicious. Clint took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease settling in his stomach. He had a job to do. He had to focus on the case. But every fiber of his being told him that his life was about to change in ways he hadn't yet realized. Inside his office, Clint met with his legal team to discuss the next steps. He needed to make sure they were ready for whatever came next. The pressure was mounting, and the weight of the case was growing heavier by the day. But he couldn't let up now. Not when he was so close to exposing the truth. "We need to dig deeper into the company's financials," Clint said, flipping open the file containing the case documents. If what Sarah said is true, we need to find out exactly what they've been up to behind the scenes. We can't just rely on the witnesses. We need hard evidence. We've already subpoenaed some of their financial records, his lead investigator, Robert, replied, tapping the folder in front of him. But we're not getting the full picture. A lot of their books are hidden behind shell companies, and the paperwork that's been turned over looks suspiciously clean. Clint frowned. Of course it does. They're hiding something. We need to find out who's been signing off on all of these transactions. Someone must have knowledge of what's been going on. Sarah had said that she overheard conversations, that she had seen enough to understand the full scope of the operation. If Clint could tie those whispers to the paperwork they had, they might have a breakthrough. But they needed to move fast. The deeper they dug, the more danger they invited into their lives. I want a full forensic audit, Clint said. Find every link, every transaction, every shell company. If they're laundering money, we'll find it. His team nodded, their faces set with determination. They had no choice but to trust Clint's instincts. He had gotten them this far. And now they had to be ready for whatever was about to come their way. As Clint left his office that evening, he noticed the black SUV again. This time, it was parked closer to the exit. His earlier paranoia returned, stronger than before. Someone was watching him, but why? Who was behind it? He decided not to take any chances. Instead of heading straight home, Clint drove to a nearby diner, where he could gather his thoughts and come up with a new plan. He didn't trust the shadows hanging over him, and he wasn't going to take any risks. Inside the diner, Clint found a quiet booth in the back. He pulled out his phone, opened his contacts, and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Detective Murphy, the gruff voice on the other end answered. "Murphy, it's Clint Eastwood," Clint said, leaning back in the booth, his voice low. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end. "What's going on, Clint?" "I've got a case I'm working on," Clint said, glancing over his shoulder. "There's something strange happening with a corporation I'm suing. I think they're tied to some bigger criminal activity. I need someone to look into their connections, see if they're involved in anything illegal." Murphy's voice hardened. "You think they're connected to organized crime?" "I don't know yet," Clint replied, "but I've got a gut feeling. I've been getting strange warnings, and there's more going on here than anyone's letting on. I need you to run a background check on some of their top executives, especially the ones who've been around for a while. And I need you to dig into their financial ties, see if they've got any connections to shady businesses." "I'll see what I can do," Murphy said after a moment. "But be careful, Clint. If this is what I think it is, you're stepping into something dangerous." Clint chuckled, though it was hollow. "I've never been afraid of a little danger." "Yeah, well, don't get cocky. I'll get back to you when I have something." Clint hung up the phone, feeling a slight sense of relief. Detective Murphy was a seasoned investigator, and if anyone could help him navigate the murky waters of corporate corruption, it was him. But even as he felt a flicker of hope, Clint couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. The situation was spiraling out of control. If Sarah was right, the people behind the corporation were willing to go to any lengths to protect their secrets. They had already shown their ability to intimidate, and now they seemed to be closing in on him. The game was changing. And Clint knew that he had to be ready for whatever came next. If he was going to take down this powerful network, he would need more than just legal tactics. He would need allies, people he could trust in the face of danger. But the question remained, who could he trust? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and endless meetings. Clint's legal team worked tirelessly to sift through mountains of documents, piecing together the puzzle of the corporation's wrongdoings. The deeper they went, the more tangled the web became. Clint had always been one to embrace the challenge, but this case was different. He could feel the heat rising, the walls closing in around him. Every step forward seemed to be met with 2 steps backward. No matter how much evidence they uncovered, the corporation's legal team was always 1 step ahead, twisting the truth and muddying the waters. And then there were the threats. It wasn't until the 3rd night in a row of receiving anonymous phone calls that Clint finally decided to confront the situation head-on. Each call had been brief, with no one on the other end but a faint click, followed by silence. But it was enough to make him uneasy. This wasn't just a typical intimidation tactic, it felt personal. They weren't just trying to scare him, they were trying to warn him off. But Clint wasn't one to be intimidated. Not now. Not when so many lives were on the line. That night, after his usual rounds at the office, Clint drove to his apartment, his thoughts tangled in the mess of the case. The SUV was there again, parked outside his building. Clint didn't even flinch as he pulled into his parking spot. He was done running from shadows. If they wanted a confrontation, they were going to get one. He took a deep breath, grabbed his briefcase, and walked toward the entrance of his building. His steps echoed in the quiet night air, and as he passed the SUV, Clint noticed the figure in the driver's seat, a tall man with dark sunglasses and an expression hidden behind the glass. Clint's blood ran cold. The man didn't make a move to acknowledge him, but there was something about him, a cold, calculating presence, that sent a shiver down Clint's spine. When Clint reached his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He locked the door behind him, double-checking the deadbolt as he stepped into the dimly lit living room. He had been living in this apartment for years, but tonight, the place felt different. The walls seemed to close in on him. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. It wasn't just about the case, it was about survival. The phone on his desk buzzed, cutting through the silence. It was a message from Detective Murphy. "I've got something," the text read. "Meet me at the usual spot in an hour. Don't trust anyone, Clint. Not even your team." Clint's stomach dropped. The cryptic message only reinforced what he had feared all along: there was someone within his circle of trust who couldn't be relied upon. But who? And why? He couldn't waste any time. He grabbed his jacket, pocketed his keys, and headed out the door, locking it behind him. The night air hit his face as he stepped into the parking garage. The SUV was still there, parked at the same spot. This time, Clint didn't hesitate. He walked past it without a second glance, heading straight for his car. It was a short drive to the diner where he and Detective Murphy had agreed to meet. The neon lights of the restaurant flickered as Clint parked in the lot, scanning the area for any sign of danger. He didn't trust anyone right now, and that included Murphy. The sudden cryptic message had raised a dozen questions in his mind. If there was someone betraying him, how much did they know? How long had they been working against him? Clint entered the diner, his eyes immediately searching the dimly lit room for Murphy. He spotted him in a corner booth, his gruff exterior visible even in the low light. Clint approached the booth, his mind racing. "Murphy," Clint said, his voice low. "What's going on?" Murphy didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling the smoke in a lazy cloud. He looked Clint up and down, as if assessing his every movement. "Clint," Murphy began, his voice cautious. "You're in deeper than you think. I've been looking into the company, like you asked. And I found something unsettling." Clint sat down across from him, his attention fully on Murphy. "What did you find?" Murphy leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's a name that keeps coming up in the financial records I've been digging through. A name that doesn't belong to anyone who's officially listed in the company's leadership. Someone who's been pulling strings behind the scenes. Clint's heart skipped a beat. Who? Murphy hesitated before sliding a photo across the table. It was a grainy image of a man in a suit, standing with a group of corporate executives. He looked familiar, but Clint couldn't place him. "This is John Richardson," Murphy said. "He's not on any of the company's public documents, but he's been involved in every major financial transaction. I tracked him to several offshore accounts that lead directly to the people Sarah was talking about." Clint studied the photo closely. "I know him. He's one of the top lobbyists in the city. But I thought he only worked on political campaigns. I didn't know he had ties to this." Murphy's expression darkened. "He's more than just a lobbyist, Clint. He's been acting as a middleman between the company and a number of other shady operations. He's got connections to organized crime, money laundering, the whole works." Clint's mind raced. If John Richardson was the key player in all of this, then they had to get to him. But it wasn't going to be easy. He was well protected, and from the way Murphy spoke, Clint knew he had his own set of enemies. "I'm not sure what's more dangerous," Clint muttered. "Richardson, or the people who are trying to stop us from finding him." Murphy's eyes narrowed. "I think you already know the answer to that, Clint. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Clint leaned back in his seat, trying to process the gravity of the situation. The deeper he dug, the more complicated everything became. There was a powerful network at work here, and every step forward brought him closer to something he wasn't sure he could handle. "I don't know," Clint said quietly. "But I do know one thing, we're not backing down. We've come too far. Whatever it takes, we'll expose them." Murphy looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Just remember, Clint, this isn't just a case anymore. It's a war. And wars don't end without casualties." Clint stood up, his resolve hardening. "I know. But we're going to win this one." As he left the diner, the feeling of being watched returned, more intense than ever. He had no idea who was listening, who was waiting for him to slip up. But one thing was clear, the game had changed. And Clint was ready to play, no matter the cost. The chill of the night air cut through Clint as he stepped out of the diner, his thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. The revelation about John Richardson had thrown everything into disarray. He knew now that he wasn't just dealing with corporate corruption, he was tangled in a vast web of criminal activity. And every thread he pulled seemed to lead deeper into a darkness he hadn't anticipated. Clint climbed into his car, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The more he uncovered, the more he realized how much he didn't know. The corporation he was suing was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the glossy exterior of their operations lay something far more sinister. Something powerful enough to destroy anyone who dared to stand in its way. As he drove through the empty streets, Clint's mind returned to Sarah. She had been the first one to open his eyes to the truth, but now her safety was in jeopardy too. The deeper Clint went, the more he realized that everyone he cared about was at risk. It wasn't just about the case anymore, it was about survival. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, relieved to see that it was a text from Murphy. "I've got an address. Richardson's been hiding out in an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It's guarded, but we can get in. Meet me there in 2 hours." Clint's heart pounded. This was it. The moment of truth. He typed a quick reply, confirming the meeting. His mind raced as he considered his options. This wasn't just a simple meeting. It was a confrontation. Richardson wasn't going to give up his secrets willingly. Clint needed to be prepared for anything. 2 hours later, Clint arrived at the warehouse. It was a stark contrast to the sleek corporate offices he was used to, the kind of place that reeked of danger. The windows were boarded up, the doors locked tight, and the air hung heavy with the smell of rust and decay. Murphy's car was parked off to the side, the only other vehicle in sight. Clint parked beside him, his heart beating faster as he stepped out into the darkness. He scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. It was eerily quiet. Too quiet. "Clint," Murphy's voice came from the shadows. Clint turned to find him standing near the entrance, his face grim. "This place is crawling with people loyal to Richardson. We need to be careful." Clint nodded, his jaw set. "I'm ready for whatever comes. Let's just make sure we get to him before he disappears again." They moved toward the entrance, the dim light from their flashlights cutting through the blackness. The warehouse was a maze of corridors and storage rooms, each one more ominous than the last. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant noise, made Clint's pulse race. It felt like they were being watched, like the walls themselves were closing in on them. "Richardson's office is at the back of the warehouse," Murphy said, his voice low. "We need to be quick. If we don't catch him tonight, he'll be gone tomorrow." Clint's hand instinctively went to his jacket pocket, where he kept his phone, ready to call for backup if things went south. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Richardson was a powerful man, and he wasn't going to give up his empire without a fight. They reached the back of the warehouse, where a single door stood slightly ajar. Clint pushed it open, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the room was dimly lit, but Clint could make out the silhouette of a desk, papers scattered across it. And sitting behind the desk, in the faint glow of the desk lamp, was John Richardson. Clint's heart skipped a beat. He had expected a confrontation, but seeing the man in person was another thing entirely. Richardson was older than Clint had imagined, graying hair, sharp features, and a cold, calculating gaze that never left Clint's face. Well, Richardson said, his voice smooth but with an underlying edge. "If it isn't Clint Eastwood. I've been expecting you." Clint's instincts flared. This wasn't a coincidence. Richardson knew exactly who he was and what he was after. And now, the game was on. "You've got a lot of explaining to do, Richardson," Clint said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You've been running a criminal operation behind the scenes, and I'm here to make sure it all comes to light." Richardson chuckled, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, Clint. You really have no idea what you're dealing with, do you?" Clint took a step forward, refusing to back down. "I've got enough to bring you down. It's over." Richardson's smile faded, and for the first time, Clint saw a flicker of something like fear in his eyes. It was brief, but it was there. "You don't understand," Richardson said, leaning forward in his chair. "This isn't just about the company. This is bigger than you, bigger than me. If you think taking me down will solve anything, you're sadly mistaken. There are people much more powerful than you or I who will make sure you disappear long before you can see justice done." Clint's stomach churned. Richardson wasn't just trying to save himself, he was trying to intimidate Clint into backing off. But Clint wasn't backing down. "Not now. I'm not afraid of you," Clint said, his voice cold. "And I'm certainly not afraid of the people you're working with. They won't protect you when everything comes crashing down." For a moment, the room was silent. Richardson studied Clint, as though weighing his next move. "Maybe you're right," Richardson finally said, his voice colder now. "But I don't need to protect myself. I just need to make sure you never leave this room." Clint's heart leapt into his throat as the door behind him slammed shut. The sound echoed in the warehouse like a death knell. The trap had been set. Before Clint could react, two men appeared from the shadows, their faces masked. They moved with practiced precision, closing in on Clint and Murphy, their intent clear. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a fight for survival. The first man lunged at Clint, but he was ready. Clint sidestepped the attack, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a clean, precise strike. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he even hit the ground. But the second man was already on him, tackling Clint to the floor. Murphy fired his gun into the air, trying to disorient the attackers. "Clint, get up. We need to move." Clint kicked the man off him and scrambled to his feet. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced toward Richardson. The man was gone, disappearing into the shadows. The game had just become far more dangerous than Clint had ever imagined. Clint's heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, shaking off the haze of the scuffle. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the walls thick with tension, the air heavy with the scent of sweat and metal. He barely had time to process the adrenaline rush before Murphy was shoving him forward, his hand clamped around Clint's arm. "We need to go, now." Murphy's voice was sharp, urgent. Clint nodded, his mind racing. Richardson was gone. They'd missed their chance to confront him, but the chase wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Without wasting a second, Clint and Murphy bolted toward the door. But before they could make it out, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. They weren't alone anymore. There were more of them, and they weren't here for pleasantries. Clint's instincts kicked in. He grabbed a metal pipe from the floor and handed it to Murphy. "We'll fight our way out if we have to," he said, his voice steady. Murphy didn't argue. He gripped the pipe tightly, nodding. "Let's make it quick." The men who had ambushed them were closing in. Clint could hear their gruff voices getting louder, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The darkness of the warehouse swallowed them as they rushed to find a way out. Every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the labyrinthine structure, the narrow hallway stretching out before them like an endless maze. "Clint, this way!" Murphy shouted, pointing to a door on their left. It was their only chance. They rushed through the door, only to find themselves in a long, narrow corridor lined with crates and abandoned equipment. The dim light from their flashlights barely cut through the shadows, and the silence was suffocating. Clint's breath came in short bursts, his mind focused on one thing: survival. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was getting closer. "Move faster," Clint urged, his pulse racing. They needed to find an exit before they were cornered. But the more they ran, the more it felt like they were being herded, pushed into a trap. "Clint!" Murphy's voice broke through his thoughts. He had stopped running, staring down at something on the floor. Clint turned around, confused. "What's wrong?" Murphy pointed to the ground. Clint's eyes narrowed as he saw the faint outline of a trap door embedded in the floor. It was cleverly concealed beneath some old rugs and debris, but there was no mistaking it. They were standing directly above it. "This is it," Clint said, realizing that they might have found their escape route. He pulled on the trap door, and with a bit of effort, it creaked open. The darkness below was pitch black, but there was no time to hesitate. They had to get out, or they would be trapped. "Come on," Clint urged. "We don't have much time." Without waiting for an answer, he jumped into the hole, the darkness swallowing him whole. Murphy followed quickly behind, and they both landed hard on the ground below, their knees buckling slightly from the impact. Clint's flashlight flickered, casting an eerie glow on the narrow underground tunnel. It was damp and cold, the walls covered in mold. But it was their only chance. They had to move fast, and they had to stay silent. They walked for what felt like hours, the air heavy with the scent of decay and earth. Every step echoed through the tunnel, making Clint feel like they were being followed. He kept his eyes forward, his mind sharp and focused. "What now?" Murphy whispered, his voice tight with apprehension. "We keep going," Clint said, his tone firm. "We need to get out of here and figure out what our next move is." They pressed on, their footfalls the only sound in the oppressive silence. The further they went, the more claustrophobic the tunnel became, the walls narrowing until they were forced to crouch to move forward. The tunnel finally opened up into a large, underground chamber, lit only by the faint glow of their flashlights. It was empty except for a few abandoned crates and what appeared to be a set of old electrical equipment. But in the center of the room was a heavy iron door. A door that looked far too sturdy to be something anyone would want to enter voluntarily. Clint paused. Something didn't feel right. "What's behind that door?" Murphy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint approached cautiously, his hand on the door handle. There was no sound from the other side. No signs of life. Just silence. "I don't know," Clint admitted. "But we have to check. We're too deep in this to turn back now." He swung the door open, and what he saw on the other side took his breath away. Inside, a high-tech security room buzzed with activity. Monitors lined the walls, showing various camera feeds from all over the city. It was clear that whoever was behind all of this had far more resources than Clint could have ever imagined. And then he saw it. On one of the screens, the face of John Richardson appeared, talking to someone off-screen. Clint's stomach twisted as he watched the conversation unfold. Richardson was speaking in code, using terms Clint couldn't quite understand. But there was no mistaking the tension in his voice. He was talking about something important, something that Clint needed to hear. But the conversation was cut short when a figure walked into view, a tall man with a scar running down his left cheek. The man spoke to Richardson in hushed tones, too low for Clint to hear. "That's our guy," Clint said, his voice cold with resolve. "We need to find out who he is." But as he stepped closer to the monitors to get a better look, the lights in the room suddenly flickered. "Clint, behind you!" Murphy shouted. Clint spun around just in time to see a shadow move in the doorway. Another figure emerged, and this time, it was someone Clint recognized, a figure from his past, someone he thought he'd left behind. It was someone he trusted. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He'd been betrayed. And now, there was nowhere to hide. The figure stepped forward into the dim light of the underground security room, and Clint's heart dropped. His mind raced, scrambling to piece together the puzzle, but for a moment, everything felt like it was falling apart. Standing before him, with a smug, familiar grin, was someone Clint thought he could trust, Detective Sam Carter. Clint's instincts screamed at him to move, but his body froze in disbelief. Sam had been one of the few people he thought was on his side. A man who had been with him through thick and thin, a former colleague he'd worked alongside in numerous cases. They had shared drinks, laughs, and their fair share of tough moments. But now, standing here, his betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. "Sam," Clint's voice cracked, as though the word itself tasted sour. Sam's grin widened, his eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "You really didn't think you'd get this far, did you, Clint?" Clint's pulse hammered in his ears. He needed answers. "What's going on, Sam? You were supposed to be on my side." Sam took a slow step forward, unfazed by Clint's sharp gaze. "Your side," he repeated with a mocking laugh. "Clint, I was never on your side." "Not really. You've been chasing shadows, thinking you were fighting for justice. But you were always just a pawn in a much bigger game. I was just waiting for you to get close enough." Clint's mind raced as he processed the words. Sam, the man who had been his ally for years, was now part of this conspiracy. But how deep did it go? How long had Sam been working for the other side? "I don't understand," Clint muttered, trying to make sense of it. "Why? All these years, I thought. Why?" Sam interrupted, a cold laugh escaping his lips. "You really want to know why? Because this whole system is broken, Clint. And I'm done playing by the rules. You were too busy with your high and mighty sense of justice to see the truth. You were never going to win. But I saw the bigger picture. I saw the opportunity. And now, I'm taking it." Clint's fists clenched at his sides. His mind was still trying to catch up, but the betrayal cut deeper than he expected. The man who had been like a brother, the man he trusted with his life, had turned into the enemy. Sam, don't do this. You know this is wrong, Clint said, his voice thick with frustration. We're supposed to be the ones who protect people, not become the very thing we fight against. Sam's expression hardened. The system is rigged, Clint. You and I both know that. So I made a choice. I joined the right side. Clint's mind flashed to the security cameras on the monitors, the faces of powerful men on the screen, the people Sam had been working with. It all clicked into place. Sam wasn't just a rogue cop. He was part of the corruption. A cog in a massive machine that had been pulling strings from the shadows. But this isn't you, Clint said, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. You've changed. You were a good cop once. What happened? I woke up, Clint, Sam replied, his voice colder than ever. I realized that the people in charge don't care about justice. They care about control. They care about power. And now, I have it. The revelation hit Clint like a freight train. Sam had gone from a man who believed in the law to someone who was willing to destroy it for the sake of power. But Clint couldn't afford to dwell on that. The stakes were higher than his personal betrayal. Sam had information that Clint needed, information that could bring down everything Richardson had built. And Clint wasn't about to let Sam walk away with it. What are you going to do now? Sam asked, a cruel amusement dancing in his eyes. You can't win this. I've already got everything in place. You're too late. Clint's anger flared, but he kept his voice steady. I'm not giving up. Not now, not ever. I'll take you down. I'll take all of this down. You can't hide behind your lies forever. The smile on Sam's face faltered for a brief moment, but it quickly returned, more menacing than before. We'll see about that, Clint. We'll see if you can stop what's already in motion. Before Clint could respond, Sam's hand shot to his waistband, and Clint instinctively moved back, his hand reaching for the gun tucked in his own holster. But Sam was faster. In the blink of an eye, he pulled a sleek, black handgun from his belt and leveled it at Clint. You really think you can win this fight? Sam sneered. You're out of your depth. I'll make sure this ends here and now. Clint's heart raced, the weight of the gun in Sam's hand making the air thick with tension. But Clint wasn't backing down, not without a fight. I'm not afraid of you, Sam, Clint said, his voice low and dangerous. I know who you are now. And I know you're not invincible. Sam's eyes narrowed. You should be. You're the one standing in the way of everything I've worked for. In a flash, Clint acted. He dived to the side, narrowly avoiding the first shot that rang out. The bullet whizzed past him, embedding itself in the wall with a loud bang. Sam's eyes widened in shock as Clint rolled to his feet, his own gun now aimed squarely at Sam's chest. You don't get to walk away from this, Sam, Clint growled, his voice full of fury and determination. You're done. The tension in the room was suffocating. The two men stood in a deadly standoff, neither one willing to give an inch. But then, a voice called out from the darkness behind them. That's enough. Clint's head whipped around. It was Murphy, his eyes narrowed, a gun aimed at Sam. Let him go, Clint. He's not worth it. Sam's grin faltered as he realized the situation had shifted. Murphy was standing between Clint and Sam now, and for the first time, Sam seemed to understand that he was no longer in control. Clint didn't lower his weapon, but he slowly backed off, his heart still pounding in his chest. The betrayal had cut deep, but it wasn't over yet. He couldn't let Sam, or anyone, get away with this. Get out of here, Sam, Murphy said coldly. Before you make things worse for yourself. Sam hesitated, his gaze flicking between the two men. Then, with a final sneer, he backed away, his hands slowly rising in mock surrender. This isn't over, Clint, he spat. You're just delaying the inevitable. And with that, Sam turned and disappeared into the shadows. Clint stood frozen, his heart still racing. It was done. Sam was gone. But the war wasn't over. In fact, it had just escalated. "We need to go," Murphy said, his voice cutting through Clint's haze of disbelief. "Before we're caught down here." Clint nodded, his mind still reeling from the betrayal. But he couldn't afford to think about that right now. He had a job to finish. And Sam was just the beginning. The sound of Sam's retreating footsteps echoed in the silence, but Clint couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was far from over. He stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, what Sam had just revealed about his involvement in everything. Betrayal stung more than Clint had anticipated, more than he wanted to admit to himself. But there was no time to dwell on it. Murphy's voice broke through Clint's thoughts. "We need to get out of here, Clint. Now." Clint nodded, his mind still racing. He forced himself to push the anger and betrayal aside for the time being. Sam was a setback, but they had bigger fish to fry. Richardson's empire was still standing, and with the pieces of the puzzle they had gathered, Clint knew that they couldn't afford to wait any longer. "We'll take the back exit," Clint said, his tone sharp. "Head straight for the car. We'll regroup, figure out our next move." Murphy was already moving toward the door. Clint followed, making sure to keep his gun at the ready. They had to assume they were still being hunted. The last thing they needed now was to run into more of Sam's associates, or worse, Richardson himself. The cold underground air filled their lungs as they moved through the darkened hallways. The maze of tunnels seemed endless, but Clint was used to finding his way out of tight spots. He'd been in worse situations before, but the betrayal stung differently. It was personal. Sam had been a friend. A few more turns and they emerged into the back alley where they had entered the building earlier. Clint's eyes immediately scanned the area, looking for any sign of a threat. The alley was quiet, too quiet. "Something feels off," Clint muttered. Murphy scanned the darkened street, his hand hovering over his weapon. "You're right. We're not alone." The hairs on the back of Clint's neck stood up. Just as he was about to say something, the sound of a car engine revved to life nearby. A sleek black sedan pulled out of an alley further down the street, its headlights glaring in the dark like a predator locking onto its prey. "Move!" Clint hissed, grabbing Murphy's arm and yanking him into the nearest doorway. They pressed their backs against the cold brick wall, hidden in the shadows. Clint's heart raced, adrenaline flooding his system as he tried to get a better look at the car. The sedan slowed, its headlights flickering as it passed the entrance to the alley. Clint held his breath, praying that the car wouldn't stop, praying that they wouldn't be noticed. But the vehicle didn't slow down. It sped off into the night. "Clear," Murphy said, sounding both relieved and tense. Clint didn't answer. His mind was working in overdrive, analyzing every detail. The car. The timing. It was too close for comfort. They were being watched, and they weren't out of danger yet. Sam had told them that things were already in motion. What did he mean by that? And how much danger were they really in? "We need to move fast," Clint said, pulling Murphy back into the alley and toward the car they had parked. "Get in the car. I have a feeling we're not out of the woods yet." The drive back to their safe house was uneventful, but Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. The city streets blurred as they raced toward their destination, but every turn, every shadow, felt like a potential threat. Murphy kept looking out the back window, watching for any sign of pursuit. Clint, however, was deep in thought. He knew they were running out of time. Sam's betrayal had made things infinitely more complicated, but it had also given him more clarity. Richardson wasn't just some criminal mastermind, he had friends in high places, people who were willing to betray anyone for power. And Sam's role in all of this was just the tip of the iceberg. As they neared the safe house, Clint's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw an unfamiliar number. His stomach twisted. It was a private number. He answered on the second ring, his voice low, cautious. Clint Eastwood. Clint, I know who you are, the voice on the other end said. It was distorted, the sound warped, but there was no mistaking the cold authority in the tone. And I know what you're doing. If you want your answers, you'd better stop playing games. You're about to learn just how far this goes. The line went dead before Clint could respond. He stared at the phone, his blood running cold. This was no longer just a fight for justice. It was a game of survival. Who was it? Murphy asked, glancing over. Clint shoved the phone back into his pocket. I don't know. But it's someone who knows more than we do. Murphy cursed under his breath. We've stirred up a hornet's nest, haven't we? Clint didn't answer. The weight of the call hung over him like a storm cloud. He had no choice but to push forward. He didn't know who was pulling the strings behind this operation, but he was determined to find out. If they were going to take Richardson down, they had to get to the heart of this conspiracy. As they pulled into the driveway of the safe house, Clint's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message from an unknown number. He opened it without hesitation. You're on the wrong side, Clint. But it's not too late. Meet me at the old docks. Midnight. The message ended abruptly, leaving no name, no further context. But Clint knew this was his chance, his one shot to get the answers he needed. You see that? Clint asked, showing Murphy the text. Murphy read it, his brow furrowing. Who do you think it is? I don't know, but they know too much. I'm going to the docks. You're coming with me. Murphy didn't hesitate. I'm with you, Clint. Let's finish this. The night was far from over. And Clint had the sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. The air was thick with tension as Clint and Murphy made their way toward the old docks. The streets of the city had grown quieter as they neared the water, the faint hum of traffic fading into the background. The cold, salty breeze carried the scent of the ocean, mingling with the musty smell of the abandoned warehouses that lined the dockside. Clint's eyes darted around, scanning every shadow, every corner. He knew they were walking into a trap. The text had been clear, meet me at the old docks. Midnight. But who was this mystery person? And why had they chosen this place, secluded, remote, a perfect spot for an ambush? I don't like this, Murphy muttered, his hand hovering over the gun at his side. This place feels wrong. Clint didn't respond. He shared the same unease, but they had no choice. They needed answers, and this was the only lead they had left. They had to find out who was behind all of this, who was pulling the strings, who was willing to go to such lengths to destroy everything Clint stood for. And Sam's betrayal was still fresh in his mind, gnawing at him like an open wound. He couldn't let that cloud his judgment, though. He had to stay focused. The old docks stretched out before them, dark and desolate, the occasional creak of the rusted metal underfoot the only sound accompanying their footsteps. A sliver of moonlight cast eerie shadows across the water, and the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore seemed almost haunting in the silence. Clint stopped for a moment, his senses heightened. There was no sign of anyone, no cars parked nearby, no figures lurking in the distance. It felt like a ghost town. Keep your eyes peeled, Clint whispered to Murphy, his voice barely audible over the soft wind. Murphy nodded, tightening his grip on his gun. You think this is a setup? Definitely, Clint said, his jaw clenched. But we don't have a choice. We need to find out what they know. They continued walking, their steps slow and deliberate. The docks were lined with decrepit warehouses, some of them boarded up, others with broken windows that had been left to the elements. The place had been abandoned for years, a relic of a bygone era. Clint couldn't help but feel like they were walking into something much bigger than a simple meeting. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. This was about survival. As they rounded the corner of one of the warehouses, Clint's sharp eyes caught a flicker of movement. A figure, cloaked in darkness, was standing at the edge of the dock, just out of the reach of the dim moonlight. Clint held up his hand, signaling Murphy to stop. He motioned toward the figure. "Stay low," Clint whispered. "Let's see who it is." They crept forward, their steps muffled by the worn wooden planks beneath them. As they drew closer, the figure came into sharper focus. A man, dressed in a black leather jacket, his face partially obscured by the shadows. His posture was casual, but Clint knew better than to assume he was harmless. This wasn't just a chance encounter. Whoever this was, they had been waiting for Clint and Murphy. The man turned slowly, his eyes glinting in the dark as he recognized them. "You're late," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. Clint's hand instinctively went to his gun, but he kept his composure. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with suspicion. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Does it matter? I'm the one with the answers you've been looking for. Or at least, the ones you think you need." Clint's patience was wearing thin, but he didn't let it show. "Cut the crap. We came here for information, not riddles." The man stepped closer, his boots scraping against the wooden dock as he moved. "You want to know who's behind it all? Who's been pulling the strings? Who's been using you as a pawn in a much larger game?" Clint tensed. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had to keep the man talking, keep him on track. "I don't have time for games," Clint said, his voice steady but intense. "Give me a name. Who's running this operation?" The man took a long, deliberate breath. "I don't think you're ready for that information," he said cryptically. "Not yet. You've got more to learn before you can take down Richardson, or anyone else involved in this mess." "Who are you?" Murphy asked, his voice a little sharper now, the tension in his posture unmistakable. The man smirked again. "Let's just say I'm someone who's seen the truth. I know what's coming. And I know you're going to need all the help you can get if you want to make it out of this alive." Clint's mind raced. This wasn't adding up. "You're talking in circles. Either you give us the information we need, or this conversation is over." The man raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. Don't get your gun in a twist. I'm not here to waste your time. But I'll give you a warning, Clint. You're walking straight into the fire. You can't stop this. You're already too deep." Clint narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean by that?" The man's expression darkened. "This isn't just about Richardson, or the people you think are behind it all. It goes much higher. Much further than you could ever imagine. You're playing in a league that's way out of your league. But hey, maybe you're the kind of guy who enjoys getting burned." Murphy stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Enough with the riddles. Who's really behind this?" The man let out a slow breath, his eyes flickering between Clint and Murphy. He stepped even closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You really want to know? Fine. You'll get your answer soon enough. But just know this, by the time you do, it'll be too late." Before Clint could respond, the man turned on his heel and disappeared into the darkness, vanishing without a trace. Clint stood there, his mind swirling with the cryptic warning, his body tense and ready for whatever might come next. "We're not getting anything useful from this guy," Murphy muttered, his eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to move." Clint nodded, his jaw tight. "We're not done yet. We'll find him again. And when we do, he'll talk." As they made their way back toward the car, Clint's mind couldn't help but race. The man's words echoed in his head, "It's too late." What did he mean? Had they already lost before they even began? The deeper Clint got into this case, the clearer it became, the stakes were much higher than anyone had realized. And time was quickly running out. The wind howled as Clint and Murphy made their way back to the car, the weight of the mystery hanging over them like a dark cloud. The figure at the docks had been just as cryptic as the threats they'd already faced. His warning about being too late was something Clint couldn't shake off, no matter how much he tried to focus on the task at hand. Once they were safely inside the car, Clint slammed the door shut with a sigh. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dashboard. The tires screeched against the wet pavement as he sped away from the docks, leaving the empty, ominous stretch of land behind. Murphy remained silent for a moment, his eyes focused on the road ahead. Clint could tell he was thinking about the same thing, the stranger's words, the implications of what they meant. "So, what now?" Murphy asked, breaking the silence. "We're no closer to finding out who's really behind this. Richardson is just the tip of the iceberg, and whoever's pulling the strings has a lot more power than we thought." Clint tightened his grip on the wheel, his eyes never leaving the road. "I know. But we can't give up now. We've come too far." Murphy leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms over his chest. "You don't think that guy was playing us?" "He's definitely hiding something," Clint replied, his voice tense. "But I have a feeling he's telling the truth about one thing, it's not just Richardson. Whoever's behind this operation is much bigger. And if we don't find out who they are, it's only going to get worse." The car was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional passing car. Clint's mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. He thought back to everything they had learned so far, Sam's betrayal, the mysterious phone call, the figure at the docks. Everything pointed to the same thing, a web of corruption, deception, and danger that extended far beyond what they had originally imagined. As they turned onto a quieter street, Clint spotted a familiar building in the distance. A small cafe that he frequented for late-night coffee and reflection. He turned to Murphy, a glimmer of determination in his eyes. "We need a break," Clint said. "Let's go to the cafe. We'll figure out our next move there." Murphy nodded, not arguing. He knew better than to question Clint when he was this focused. The cafe was just a few blocks away, and soon they were parked in front of it. The place was nearly empty at this hour, with only a few scattered patrons nursing their drinks in silence. Inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee hit them, grounding them in the moment. Clint ordered his usual, black coffee, no sugar, and sat at a small corner table, pulling out his phone to check for any new messages. There was nothing of interest, except for a couple of missed calls from his contact at the local police department. He knew he needed to follow up, but for now, they needed to plan. Murphy took a seat across from him, his expression serious. "We've got to start thinking about our next move. If that guy's right, and things are bigger than we thought, we don't have much time." "I know," Clint said, rubbing his eyes. "I'm starting to think it's not just about stopping Richardson. It's about exposing the system that's allowing this to happen in the first place." Murphy leaned forward, his voice low. "You're talking about going after more than just one person, Clint. You're talking about taking down an entire network." Clint met his gaze, his jaw tightening. "Exactly. And if we don't do this now, they'll come for us next. Sam was just a pawn, and now we're the next target. We need to stay ahead of them." Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden ringing of Clint's phone. He picked it up without hesitation, hoping it was someone with information that could help them. "Clint Eastwood," he said into the receiver. "Clint, it's Jane," the voice on the other end said. Jane Hartley was a journalist he had worked with in the past. Smart, reliable, and resourceful. "I've got something you need to see. Something big. You're not going to believe this, but it's connected to everything." Clint's pulse quickened. "What is it? Where are you?" "I'll send you the location," Jane said, her voice urgent. It's a risk, but if you want to stop this, you need this information. Meet me there in 1 hour. Don't bring anyone else. Just you. The line went dead before Clint could respond. Who was that? Murphy asked, leaning in. It's Jane. She's got something for us, Clint replied, already standing up. We need to go. Now. They didn't waste any time. Clint paid for their drinks, and they were out the door, heading for the car. The streets were darker now, the quiet of the night broken only by the sound of their tires against the pavement. Clint's mind was racing. What did Jane have? Was this the break they had been waiting for? As they pulled up to the location Jane had sent, Clint's heart sank. The place was a rundown building on the outskirts of the city, an area known for its shady businesses and seedy dealings. It wasn't the kind of place Clint liked to frequent, but if Jane had information that could help them, he couldn't afford to hesitate. They parked across the street and approached the building on foot, keeping to the shadows. Clint's senses were on high alert, every footstep and creak of the building making his pulse race. He had a bad feeling about this. Something was off. Jane was waiting for them near the back entrance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked over her shoulder nervously before stepping forward to greet them. You're here, she said, her voice trembling. You won't believe what I've found. Clint didn't waste time with pleasantries. What is it, Jane? What's going on? Jane handed him a folder, her hands shaking. I dug into some of Richardson's associates. You won't believe what I uncovered. These are the people really pulling the strings. The ones you're after. And it goes straight to the top. Clint's fingers tightened around the folder as he opened it, scanning the documents inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. God, he muttered under his breath. This is bigger than I thought. Murphy leaned in, his eyes widening as he glanced at the pages. These names, this is insane. Clint's mind was already racing. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a battle for everything he stood for. And the storm that was brewing around them was about to break wide open. Clint stared at the papers in his hands, the documents flicking like ghosts in his fingers. Each name on the list was more chilling than the last, each connection weaving a tighter web of power and deceit that went far beyond anything he had imagined. The names of corrupt officials, businessmen with deep pockets, and even a few law enforcement officers dotted the page, each one a thread in a larger, much more dangerous network. This can't be real, Murphy muttered, scanning the list himself. You're telling me all these people are involved? Clint didn't answer immediately. He was still absorbing the scope of what they had uncovered. Jane had outdone herself, but at the same time, she'd opened a door that Clint wasn't sure he was ready to walk through. Is this how deep it goes? He asked, his voice hoarse. Jane nodded grimly. Yes. And it's not just about Richardson. He's a pawn in something much bigger. These people have their hands in everything, politics, law enforcement, and the underworld. They've been pulling strings for years, making sure they stay in control, no matter the cost. Clint's fingers clenched into fists, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him like a vice. This wasn't just about stopping one man. This was about taking down an entire system that had been built on corruption, manipulation, and lies. Every move Clint had made up to this point had been part of a much larger game, a game that had been rigged from the start. We need to act fast, Clint said, his voice low and determined. We can't let them get away with this. If we go public with this, it's going to send shockwaves through the entire city. We need to make sure we have everything we need before we expose them. Murphy looked up from the documents, his face tense. You're right. But we can't do this alone. There are too many people involved, and they have too much power. We need help. Clint shook his head. I don't trust anyone right now. Not after what happened with Sam. We're on our own until we have solid evidence, something that can't be disputed. Jane spoke up then, her voice laced with concern. Clint, you're going to need more than just evidence. These people are dangerous. They'll stop at nothing to protect themselves. I've been digging into their operations for months, and I'm telling you, if they catch wind of what I've found, they'll come after us. Clint looked at her, his eyes hard. He could see the fear in her eyes, and he understood. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. This was a fight for survival. We've already got a target on our backs, Clint said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet rage. We might as well make it count. Murphy stood up, running a hand through his hair. So what's the plan? We go in, take down Richardson's operation, and expose everyone. Clint's gaze hardened, his mind already working through the possibilities. It's not just Richardson's operation. He's small time compared to the people pulling the strings. We need to take out the head of the snake. Get the evidence, disrupt their operations, and take them down all at once. Jane's eyes widened. You want to hit them all at once? Clint, that's insane. We're talking about going after an entire network of people with resources you can't even imagine. You'll be fighting a war on all fronts. I know, Clint said, his tone resolute. But we don't have a choice. They've already made their move, and they won't stop until they destroy everything. We have to hit them before they can do that. There was a long silence as they all absorbed the gravity of the situation. Jane looked around nervously, as if she feared someone might be watching them even now. She swallowed hard before speaking again. I have one more thing for you, she said, pulling out a flash drive from her pocket. It's encrypted, but if you get it to someone you trust, they can crack it open. It's got everything, files, emails, transactions. The whole damn operation. Clint reached out and took the flash drive, slipping it into his pocket. We'll figure it out. Thank you, Jane. You've done more than anyone else would. She looked relieved but still fearful. Just promise me you'll be careful, Clint. You're not just fighting a couple of bad guys now. You're taking on a system. And that system doesn't let people walk away. Trust no one. Clint nodded. I'll remember that. Murphy cleared his throat. We need to get back to the office. We've got work to do. Clint looked at Jane one last time, giving her a reassuring nod. Stay safe, Jane. We'll take it from here. As they walked out of the building, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as they crossed the street to the car, and he couldn't help but feel like the walls were closing in. Every step felt like they were walking deeper into enemy territory. The city that Clint had once fought to protect now felt like a battlefield, and he was right in the heart of it. The drive back to their office was tense. Every turn, every alley felt like a potential ambush. Clint's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts: how to break the story, who to trust, how to take down the entire system without getting themselves killed in the process. There was no clear path, no simple way forward. But one thing was certain: he was in this fight until the bitter end. When they arrived at the office, Clint pulled out the flash drive and inserted it into his computer. His fingers hovered over the keys as the files began to load. They were encrypted, just as Jane had said, but Clint had a few tricks up his sleeve. Within minutes, the files were decrypted, revealing a treasure trove of information. Names, dates, coded messages, financial transactions, everything they needed to take down the network, all in front of him. This is it, Clint whispered, his heart pounding. We've got them. But even as the words left his lips, a sense of dread washed over him. They had the evidence, but now they had to figure out how to use it without getting caught in the crossfire. Every decision from here on out could be their last. Murphy leaned over Clint's shoulder, his voice grim. What's the plan now? Clint took a deep breath, staring at the screen in front of him. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The plan, Clint said, looking up at Murphy, is to burn the whole damn thing down. Clint stared at the glowing screen, the mountain of evidence before him seeming almost too much to handle. The names, the dates, the transactions, it was all there, a clear and undeniable trail that led straight to the heart of the conspiracy. But as the full weight of what they were about to do sank in, a cold feeling crept into the pit of Clint's stomach. He was used to high stakes, used to danger. But this was a whole new level. Murphy was pacing behind him, glancing nervously at the clock on the wall. "We don't have much time, Clint. We've got the information we need, but we need to move fast. If we wait too long, they'll catch wind of what we're doing." Clint nodded, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He'd been thinking about their next move for hours, but now that they were on the brink of exposing everything, a new sense of urgency gripped him. The people they were up against had deep roots, powerful allies in places they couldn't even imagine. If they wanted to take them down, they had to do it right, or they'd end up just another footnote in the city's history. "I know," Clint said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of the decision. "But we can't just rush in blindly. We need to make sure we have everything covered. If we go public with this, there's no turning back. We'll be targets, and so will everyone involved in bringing this to light." Murphy stopped pacing and leaned against the desk, his eyes narrowing. "Then we need to make sure we've got backup. People who can help us if things go sideways." Clint's mind raced. He had always worked alone, trusted few people, but now, more than ever, he realized that this fight was too big for just him and Murphy. They needed to build an army, even if that meant putting their trust in people who had their own agendas. "I'll make the calls," Clint said, finally moving toward the phone. "We need to reach out to Jane, and I've got a few contacts at the police department who might still be on our side. They're risking their careers, but if we can get them to back us up, we might stand a chance." Murphy was already nodding, clearly on the same page. "And what about the media? If we're going to expose this, we need a platform, someone who can broadcast it to the world before they have a chance to cover it up." Clint rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I've got a contact at the Times, someone I can trust. They'll make sure the story gets out." The plan was taking shape, but Clint couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something much darker than even he had imagined. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into a labyrinth of deception and danger. And as much as he hated to admit it, he knew there was no going back. He made the first call to Jane, and her voice was strained when she picked up. "Clint, is everything all right?" she asked. There was a tremor in her voice, and Clint could hear the fear she was trying to hide. "We've got everything we need," Clint said, his voice steady. "But we're going to need your help one last time. We're going to expose everything, Jane. Are you in?" There was a long pause before she answered, her voice quiet but firm. "You know I'm in. I've been waiting for this. But Clint, I've been getting threats. They know I've been digging around. You need to be careful. This is bigger than any of us." Clint's eyes darkened. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing Jane's fear made the situation all the more real. This wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about survival. "We're ready," Clint said. "I'll be in touch soon with the details. Just make sure you're safe." The call ended, and Clint turned to Murphy, his mind already spinning with the next steps. They had their team, or at least the start of it. But it was going to take more than just a few trusted allies to bring down an entire system. They needed leverage, something that would make the authorities and the public listen. Something that couldn't be ignored. Clint picked up his phone and dialed the contact at the Times. The phone rang once, then twice, before the editor's voice came on the line. "Clint, what's going on?" "It's late. I need a favor," Clint said, cutting straight to the point. "I've got a story that's going to blow the lid off this city. But I need your help to get it out there." I've got proof of a massive corruption network, and it goes all the way to the top. The editor's silence was deafening, but Clint could feel the gravity of the situation sinking in. I'm listening, the editor said finally. I'll send you the files, Clint replied. Make sure it gets out, no matter what. If you can't, then we're on our own. I'll make it happen, the editor said. But Clint, be careful. If this is as big as you say, they'll come for you. I'm counting on you, Clint said, hanging up without another word. Murphy was already gathering the papers, reviewing the final details. We've got everything in place. The media's ready to go. What's next? Clint's jaw tightened as he thought about their final move. There was no going back now. The pieces were in place. All they needed was to push the button and let the world know what was really happening behind closed doors. We hit them with everything, Clint said, his voice low and dangerous. All at once. No warning. No time for them to cover their tracks. We burn the whole thing to the ground. Murphy nodded, his face grim. And if it all falls apart? Clint met his gaze, the weight of everything they had been through clear in his eyes. Then we fight until the end. As they prepared to make their final move, Clint felt the pressure mounting. He had made enemies, many of them powerful, and this was the moment where everything would either fall into place or shatter beyond repair. There was no middle ground, no second chance. The storm was coming, and Clint Eastwood was ready to face it head-on. The clock was ticking. Clint stared at the glowing screen in front of him. Every document, every piece of evidence he had painstakingly gathered over the last few weeks was now in the hands of the public. The world was about to see what he had uncovered, and with it, the faces of those who thought they could pull the strings without consequence. But as he sat there, staring at the final draft of the exposé, something gnawed at him. There was a feeling in his gut that he couldn't shake. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It wasn't just about delivering justice or taking down bad guys. This was a battle for survival, his survival, Jane's, Murphy's, and anyone else who dared stand with them. His phone buzzed on the desk, cutting through the silence. He glanced at the screen, Jane. Clint picked up immediately. What's the status? It's happening, Jane's voice came through, tight with tension. The Times is running the story tomorrow. But Clint. I'm not sure we're going to make it through this. I've been getting calls all night. They're watching me. Watching all of us. Clint exhaled slowly, rubbing his forehead. He'd known the danger was coming, but hearing Jane's voice crack under the pressure made the reality of the situation hit home. They had pushed all their chips to the center of the table, and now there was no going back. We knew this was coming, Clint said. But you're right. We have to stay sharp. Don't let them get too close. We've got one shot at this, and we're not going to let them take us down. You sound confident, Jane said, her voice filled with a mix of admiration and disbelief. But you've seen how deep this runs. These people, they don't lose. They don't let people like us walk away. Clint was silent for a moment. He could hear the strain in her words, but he knew they couldn't afford to lose hope now. We won't walk away. Not this time, Clint said, his voice hard with determination. We've got the truth on our side. And that's a weapon stronger than anything they've got. Another pause on the line, then Jane let out a breath. You're right. Let's just make sure we all make it through this. I'm trusting you with this, Clint. Just, don't forget who you're up against. I won't, Clint said. Stay safe, Jane. He hung up, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned to Murphy, who had been silently watching him the entire time, waiting for a sign. We're about to make history, Clint said, his eyes steely. But we need to get moving. We need to hit them fast. Once the story breaks, there's no telling how they'll react. We don't know how deep this goes, but we can't wait for them to make the first move. Murphy nodded, his jaw tight. Where do we go from here? We make sure the world knows. We make sure every piece of evidence goes public, and we make sure they can't cover it up. We expose everything, the names, the deals, the connections. We hit them all at once. Then we go into hiding. Murphy's expression hardened. You sure about that? Hiding? We could be heroes, Clint. Clint shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. Heroes don't always survive, Murphy. But if we do this right, we'll at least have made a difference. We'll make sure no one can ever pull this off again. But that doesn't mean we're safe. We can't afford to be arrogant. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair and threw it on, then headed for the door. Murphy followed close behind, not saying a word. They were moving quickly now, no more planning, no more second-guessing. The time for action was here. As Clint stepped out into the cool night air, he could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. They were so close, and yet the threat of what could happen next was ever present. He could almost hear the footsteps behind him, the eyes that were watching his every move. There was no such thing as safety now. It was a race against time. They arrived at the underground parking garage where they had set up their final meeting place. A nondescript, safe location that Jane had found, away from prying eyes. As Clint approached the dimly lit elevator, his thoughts kept drifting back to Jane's warning. They were up against a system that didn't lose, a system that would stop at nothing to silence the truth. They were all in. They had given everything to bring this fight to the public. But the real battle was only just beginning. Inside the safe house, the final details were being checked. Jane had sent over all the decrypted files, the final proofs that linked the highest-ranking officials to the web of corruption that had been festering in the city for years. It was time to drop the bomb. Clint looked at the screen, his hands trembling for the first time in days. This wasn't just about taking down a few bad players. This was a reckoning, a moment where the truth would either topple an empire or bury them all. He hit send. Within moments, the exposé was live. The first headline flashed across news feeds, and then another, and another. Each one more damning than the last. The public would know everything. There was no going back now. But Clint's moment of triumph was short-lived. The phone in his pocket buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. Clint Eastwood, he answered, his voice cold. Clint, I hope you're ready for the consequences of your actions, a gravelly voice said on the other end of the line. The voice was distorted, but Clint could tell it was one of the people behind the corruption. Clint felt his blood run cold, but he didn't flinch. You made your move. Now it's our turn. The voice laughed, a low, menacing sound. You think exposing us will change anything? You think you've won? You have no idea what's coming. No idea at all. The call ended abruptly. Clint turned to Murphy, his face stone cold. It's just begun. But we're not backing down. Murphy nodded. No turning back now. Clint took a deep breath, his mind racing. They had just lit the fuse, and now there was no telling how far this would go. But he wasn't afraid. He had walked through hell before, and he would walk through it again if it meant bringing justice to those who thought they were untouchable. The war was just beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?